Welcome to Africa Media Australia. My name is Clash Shawadi. Thank you very much for watching this video. As you probably would know, the crisis continues in Melbourne within African Australian community, grappling with the spike in youth offending involving members of the African Australian community, more specifically the South Sudanese young people who have been involved in some antisocial and criminal behaviors, and the media has continued to talk about this. The community is now also being actively involved in trying to resolve this matter. The police is working with the community now. They have put together, or they are putting together, a task force that will consider some of the options that need to be looked at to trying to minimize youth offending within African Australian communities. We thought we would continue to talk to key decision makers and policy makers. We've had a conversation, or rather an interview with Minister Robin Scott, the Minister for Multicultural Affairs. We've spoken to the Police Minister here in Victoria. And today we're going to be speaking to Senator Richard Di Natale from the Greens. And we thought we will ask Senator Di Natale what he thinks about some of these issues. So I've got Senator Di Natale online with me today. Senator, thank you very much for your time to Africa Media Australia, and Happy New Year.
Same to you.
Now, Senator, there's been a number of incidents that have involved young people from South Sudanese background mostly, and that have been reported widely in the media as African gang. And I would like to really know what you think about this whole situation.
Well, I think firstly that the reporting has been abysmal, to be honest. I think what it's done is tried to create a problem where the offending has been linked to young African men, when the reality is that most offending is done by older people. It's done by people who are Australian born, and in fact that's backed up by the crime figures. Obviously the political comments made by people like Peter Dutton were disgraceful. His comments that people were scared to go out at restaurants at night time because of fear of African gang violence were appalling. They were disgraceful comments. He has no evidence to back up those claims, and all they do is serve to divide the community. I was going to say, and those comments were reiterated by other members of the Liberal Party, and the reality is that what we have to do is recognise that most offending is not done by people of African backgrounds. Indeed, most offending is done by older people, but the majority of whom are born here in Australia. We've also seen a decrease in some of the crime statistics over the last year in Victoria, highlighting that far from a crisis, what we have is issues that need to be addressed, but they need to be done in a way that's respectful, that allows us to recognise what the problems are and put in place solutions that actually work, rather than whipping up fear and division in the community.
Well, we'll get to the Liberal Party's reaction a little bit later. Here in Victoria, there has been a lot of pressure put on both the government and Victoria Police to get them to agree, to accept, or some would say to admit, that there is an African gang problem that is out of control. What do you think about that?
Well, I listen to the police, and I think the police have said when you start putting labels on this by calling this offending gang violence, it's not truthful because it doesn't have the hallmarks of that, and it actually gives those people a status that they don't deserve. So it's counterproductive. So the police have said that, in fact, we shouldn't be calling this gang violence. And if you look at, for example, incidents over the weekend, there was an incident last Thursday in Torquay. 100 young people, men, mainly from Anglo backgrounds, involved in violent activity. No one called that gang violence, and so we shouldn't call this gang violence. What we should recognise is that when there's offending, people who are committing crimes, of course, they need to be dealt with through the justice system. But we've also got to put in place things that prevent young people from falling into the trap of offending. And that involves a much more complex response. It involves making sure that you provide education and employment opportunities for young people, and if you're serious about it, you invest in that part of the solution rather than trying to whip up the fear and division that we've seen with recent comments.
Senator, what do you think about what the Victorian government has been doing in sort of addressing this situation, and what it has been doing long term to try and help members of the African Australian communities?
Well, we clearly need a greater investment in things like migrant-specific employment services. We need to do more to engage with young people in schools, young people who might be at risk. So we need a greater investment in those areas. And we know that works when you do that. You help people into pathways with employment, further educational opportunities. You know that reduces the risk of people falling into criminal activity. The response from the Liberal opposition here in Victoria, again, has been appalling. We've seen ministers contradict senior members of the police force. The senior members of the police force saying that they don't believe that we should be calling this gang violence. And then you have shadow ministers saying, well, they disagree with the police. And they're doing it purely for political purposes. It's an election year. Jumping up and down and trying to create an election around law and order is a well-worn political tactic. Trying to beat up on minority groups, create fear in the community, again, it's a very well-worn political tactic. But it's, I think, a complete failure of anything positive that the Liberal opposition offers here in Victoria, that they've had to resort to these sorts of tactics.
Do you think members of the Liberal Party understand the level of damage that some of their comments have on the lives of African Australian communities? Do they understand the repercussions of some of their statements in the media?
I don't think they care, and I think that's a really sad state of affairs. I don't think when people like Minister Dutton or indeed the opposition leader Matthew Guy stand up and make those sorts of comments, I don't think they care about the repercussions this has on members of the African community. They're more interested in trying to win votes from people who might be susceptible to a fear campaign around violence and criminal activity. So what we do know, and I know this because I've met with members of the African community, is it does have a very profound impact. It targets members of the African community. It creates division within the community. What it does do is it makes people feel unsafe and feel like they're being targeted and victimised. You see the response on social media and some of the appalling comments that individuals make, and it makes people feel unsafe and unwelcome. And that's not what we should be doing in a multicultural country like Australia.
Now, Senator, the Greens have traditionally been friends of African Australian communities, but how come we haven't seen much in the media from the Greens in relation to this whole crisis?
Oh, well, we've produced a number of media releases and posts through our social media channels, and indeed I'm hoping to have an opinion piece published in one of the mainstream papers over the next few days. I've submitted that and hoping that will be published. So we've certainly been out there and arguing the case that this is divisive and unhelpful. Indeed, last night I went to an African restaurant in Footscray and broke bread with some members of the African community. It is something that we're very mindful of, and unfortunately we don't control what gets published, what gets said by the Greens. That's not out of our control, but we have been very strong in our condemnation of the government and indeed in our support for members of the African community.
Now, you may be holding the balance of power in the next Victorian Parliament. What can you promise African Australian communities that you may be able to do for them if you are in that position?
Well, the first thing to say is the most important thing they can expect from the Greens is a strong support and a friendship with the African community, because we're a party that believes that multiculturalism is one of the great things about our nation, and we want to keep building on it. You know, we've got a choice. We either succumb to, the fear that's perpetuated by people like Minister Dutton and retreat inwards, or we continue to build the great multicultural nation that we are, and that means making people from right across the world feel welcome. We know, if we look at our history, the hugely positive contributions made by so many different groups, whether they were the Italians and Greeks, Italians in my case like my parents and grandparents, the Vietnamese communities. There are so many different communities who have contributed to Australian prosperity, and we know that the African community will be part of that great contribution and help build the success of Australia. And it's a great thing, because it's a great thing for Australia socially and economically to have the contribution of so many people from right around the world to help make us the very strong nation that we are today. I think specifically we'll certainly look at how we can continue to build the investment in migrant-specific employment services, job-active providers, to do what we can there. More outreach support for working with young people in particular, a whole lot of activity in terms of youth outreach and support for that. We, for example, met with the African Student Organisation and talking about how we can best support the work that they're doing to help reach out to young people and create opportunities for young people. We'd like to see more African people represented in powerful positions. We'd like to see more African young people become the next generation of leaders in the Australian community, and that means within all the institutions that we have at our disposal. The Greens have been running a fellowship to support people from migrant communities to understand more about politics and to provide a pathway for them to enter Australian politics. I'd love to see Africans being members of our party and having a pathway towards representation, being the next members of parliament. And I think we've got to make sure that we've got African people representing all the institutions of power in Australia, whether that be politics, whether that be within the justice system, to ensure that we've got strong African voices and role models for younger people within the community. I mean, that all takes time, but the most important thing is to demonstrate that you're committed to achieving that, because that's how you build multiculturalism in Australia, and that's how it continues to be a successful part of who we are.
Senator, you mentioned there about the need for more investment in trying to help communities address their issues. Now, what do you think about the current funding model? Many community leaders have been saying for quite some time now that the money that is given to help communities is actually not helping in the best possible way. It's not producing the results or the outcomes that the community wants, because many of these service providers have very little understanding of the culture and psychosocial needs of Africans in Australia. Do you think it's time maybe to review this whole funding model?
Yes, I do. I mean, most of those services are delivered through state governments, and of course I'm the leader of the federal party, so that's certainly something that my state colleagues are interested in helping to address. I mean, we've got to make sure that money's being spent on the ground delivering services rather than on bureaucracy and layers of burdensome regulation that does nothing to actually provide services on the ground. So that's obviously very important. We have to do everything we can to ensure that the money goes to where it's needed. I think it's important that we work, look at the role that young people play here, the next generation of leaders within the African community, and to continue to support them as much as we support many of the other different aspects of this, including migrant-specific employment services.
Senator, talking about the media, what do you think about the way media is misrepresenting communities? A lot of community leaders from multicultural backgrounds have been lamenting the misrepresentation, the vilification of their communities by biased and racist media reporting. Many media are trying to put a link between ethnicity and crime and all that sort of thing. Is it time maybe to review regulations?
Yes, I do. I mean, the reporting around this so-called crisis has been appalling, and what you're seeing is the repeating of a whole lot of mistruths, and distortions. There should be a responsibility on our broadcasters to report in a way that actually raises awareness of Australia's diversity and that prevents the misrepresentation of all cold communities, including the African community. I think one thing we can do is have the Australian Press Council develop a stronger broadcast media code of conduct, so that what we see is a code of conduct that ensures that Australia's cultural diversity is respected, and that reporting is not done in a way to stigmatise one ethnic group within the community. So that certainly can be done through the Australian Press Council. They have the capacity to have a much stronger code of conduct that requires them to uphold a standard that's higher than the standard that's being met today.
Senator, quite often politicians have very little appetite for change in this space, and a lot of times the complaint processes that go through either ACMA or the Australian Press Council end up with very little outcome for the community anyway. What do you think is the right way to address this?
Well, look, it's a very difficult area because we do need to respect the role of a free and independent media, and it's always difficult when governments begin to get involved in what can and can't be said. And so we do need to try and keep those things as separate as we can. Having said that, the Australian Press Council does have a role to play in helping to define what standards are acceptable and to ensure that they do what they can to enforce those standards. And that is, at the moment, we don't even have that. We don't have a strong and rigorous code of conduct where there's an expectation created that people are reporting in a way that ensures that there's awareness of Australia's cultural diversity, and that prevents the misrepresentation and the untruths that are often very common when we're talking about different ethnic communities.
Senator Natale, what would be your last message to the African Australian communities out there who may be watching this?
I suppose the most important thing I'd say is that the Greens stand with you. We're so proud to have the African community being such a strong and vibrant part of the Australia that we know and appreciate today. We're very, very grateful for the enormous contribution that so many members of the African community make. We want you to know that there are many people in Australia. Indeed, I think the significant majority of Australians do value the fact that Australia is a place that has great cultural diversity and that it makes us a stronger, more vibrant, a better place to live. And to know that we stand there in solidarity with you, that the Greens and many other Australians value the wonderful contribution you make to Australian life, to know that we're going to continue to take a stand against people like Peter Dutton, whose comments were just so hurtful and divisive, that we're going to continue to push hard to make sure that young people who are at risk have the services that we know will help them in finding pathways into meaningful employment, to know that we'll do everything we can to create educational opportunities for young people, to make sure that there are culturally appropriate services that help people through the transition, particularly for newly arrived migrants, language services, employment services and education services that meet their needs. And that over and above everything else, we will continue to fight hard to make sure Australia continues as a nation that is multicultural and that celebrates the fact that we have so many people from right across the world who call Australia home.
Thank you very much, Senator Natale. We appreciate your time to Africa Meet Australia, and we hope to have more opportunities to talk to you in relation to these type of issues and others that may be of interest to the African Australian communities.
Thanks, Clyde. Bye-bye.